born an orphan in a small American town, left with nothing but hunger, loneliness, and uncertainty. Yet from the shadows of despair, he rose step by step across oceans, wars, and impossible challenges until millions of lives depended on him. What happened in his journey that turned this forgotten child into a man the world could never ignore? He was Herbert Hoover, born in West Branch, Iowa, in 1874. The year was 1874. In the small rural town of West Branch, Iowa, a child was born into a simple Quaker family. His name was Herbert Hoover. No one in that quiet wooden village could have imagined that this boy, fragile, quiet, and often sick, would one day carry the weight of a nation on his shoulders. Herbert's early life seemed ordinary, filled with the rhythms of farm work, church gatherings, and the smell of fresh-baked bread in his mother's kitchen. His father, Jesse, was a hard-working blacksmith, and his mother, Huldah, was a woman of strong faith and tender care. For a short while, Herbert knew what it meant to be loved, to be safe, to fall asleep under a roof where warmth was certain. But fate was cruel. When Herbert was only 6 years old, tragedy struck. His father collapsed suddenly, his heart failing him as he worked. The sound of hammering on the anvil, once strong and steady, fell silent forever. Herbert watched as the village carried his father's body away, the man who had been the family's protector. Loss hung heavy over the Hoover home. His mother tried to keep the family together, sewing clothes, praying every night, and comforting her 3 children with whispers of hope. But grief wears the body down, and only 3 years later, Huldah grew ill and passed away. Herbert was 9 years old, and an orphan. Imagine the silence of that small house after her death. The smell of his mother's cooking gone. The warmth of her embrace gone. Herbert, just a boy, sat in a wooden chair staring at the cold fireplace, his tiny hands gripping the edge as though he could hold on to the life that had slipped away. The townspeople pitied him, but pity could not feed him. He was sent to live with relatives, different houses, different beds, never his own. Each time he carried a small bundle of clothes, he carried also the fear of being unwanted. He often walked the dirt roads alone, looking at the sky, wondering why God had taken everything from him. The other boys in the town played with marbles or chased each other through the fields, but Herbert often sat apart. His eyes were older than his years, carrying grief and questions no child should bear. At night, lying awake, he whispered to himself, "If I am nothing now, what will I become?" No one knew then that the answer to that question would shake the world. After his mother's death, Herbert Hoover's life became a journey of constant movement. The boy with no parents was passed from one relative to another, each house unfamiliar, each bed cold. In every new place, Herbert carried his small bundle of clothes and the same heavy question in his heart: am I truly wanted here? His uncle, a stern man, believed in hard work above all else. He handed Herbert chores that would break the back of grown men hauling water, chopping wood, scrubbing floors until his small hands bled. Herbert was just a boy, but he worked with silent endurance, never complaining. At night, when he lay down on a thin mattress in a corner of the room, exhaustion pulled at his body, but his mind remained restless. The other children teased him for being poor and parentless. They had mothers who tucked them in, fathers who gave advice. Herbert had only memories, and memories could not keep him warm. Often, he slipped away from the laughter of others, choosing solitude on the dirt roads outside the village. He would sit on a fence post, staring at the horizon, whispering promises to himself. One day, I will not be small. One day, I will be something. School offered no comfort. Herbert was quiet, awkward, and often overlooked. He had no polished shoes, no fine books, only determination. Teachers noticed the boy's silence, but behind it was a hunger, not for food this time, but for knowledge. He read what little he could find, devouring pages late at night under dim light. Still, grief never left him. Sometimes in the dead of night, Herbert dreamed of his parents' voices. He could almost hear his father's hammer striking iron, almost feel his mother's hands guiding him in prayer. But when he woke, only silence and shadows remained. Yet within that silence, a fire was forming. The boy who had nothing was slowly shaping a heart of iron and a will unbreakable. Hardship was not destroying him, it was forging him. Every insult, every empty night, every tear became a stone in the foundation of his future. The town called him the boy who lost everything. They could not see that this very loss was carving a leader. By the time Herbert Hoover reached his teenage years, he had already endured more pain than most grown men. Yet the boy's silence was not weakness. It was the shield of someone who had learned too early that life takes more than it gives. At 13, Herbert left West Branch and went to live with his Uncle John in Oregon. The journey itself was long and uncertain, a lonely train ride across miles of farmland and forests. As the wheels clattered against the tracks, Herbert pressed his forehead against the cold window, watching the world blur past. He was only a boy, carrying no parents, no money, no safety. But he carried something more powerful, the stubborn belief that he could shape his own destiny. His uncle was strict, practical, and not much for affection. Work hard, earn your keep was his rule. Herbert took odd jobs, sweeping floors, stacking goods, even working as an office boy for hours without pause. Each coin he earned felt like a small victory, proof that he could survive in a world that had nearly swallowed him. At school, he was shy, often sitting in the back, unnoticed. Yet whenever he picked up a book, his entire world shifted. He devoured stories of explorers, leaders, and scientists. Their courage became his fuel. Late at night, when others slept, Herbert bent under a flickering lamp, whispering to himself, "If they can, why not me?" But life still tested him. He was often hungry, sometimes cold, always uncertain of tomorrow. The teasing of other boys continued. "Orphan boy. Poor boy." They laughed as he carried heavy bundles through the streets. But Herbert never lashed out. Instead, he clenched his fists in silence, vowing that one day, the laughter would stop. In those years, Herbert developed something stronger than muscle. He built resilience. He learned to bend without breaking, to endure without complaint, to see beyond the pain of today toward the promise of tomorrow. No one in Oregon could have guessed that the quiet, awkward boy sweeping floors would one day stand in the White House, but the truth was already written in his heart. Every insult, every empty pocket, every lonely night, it was all preparing him for a future no one could yet imagine. By the late 1880s, Herbert Hoover was no longer just a lonely orphan. He was a young man with a quiet fire in his heart. Every struggle, every hardship, had carved him into someone who refused to give up. But his greatest test still lay ahead. In Oregon, while working odd jobs, Herbert discovered an opportunity that seemed almost impossible for a boy of his background: higher education. The newly established Stanford University in California had opened its doors. Admission would not be easy, and for a poor orphan, it seemed almost out of reach. But Herbert had already learned one lesson in life: when the world tells you no, you find another way to make it yes. He studied relentlessly, often borrowing books, reading under dim lamps until his eyes burned. His hands were rough from labor, but his mind was sharp, restless, and hungry for knowledge. When the time came, he took the entrance examination. With trembling hands and steady determination, Herbert wrote every answer, every word carrying the weight of his orphan years. And against the odds he passed. Arriving at Stanford in 1891, Herbert felt like he had stepped into another world. The grand buildings, the polished students, the air of privilege, it was a far cry from the broken roads of Iowa and Oregon. He owned only simple clothes, often too worn for his classmates' liking. Some mocked his appearance, whispering, "He doesn't belong here." But Herbert belonged. He made himself belong. To pay his way, he took jobs, laundry work, typing papers, even running errands for professors. While others partied, Herbert worked late into the night, barely sleeping, his determination carrying him forward. It was at Stanford that Herbert discovered geology, a science that fascinated him. The study of rock's earth and the hidden wealth beneath the soil seemed to mirror his own life, the idea that strength could be found beneath layers of pressure and time. He declared it his field of study, telling himself, "If I dig deep enough, I will find my future." Despite hunger, despite exhaustion, despite every whisper that he would fail, Herbert Hoover endured. His classmates began to see him not as the poor orphan, but as the quiet young man who refused to give in. No one could have guessed then that the boy sweeping floors in Oregon, the orphan with no home, was taking his first steps toward the world stage. The road was still long, but destiny had already chosen him. By the mid-1890s, Herbert Hoover had something he had never dreamed possible, a university degree. But a diploma alone was not enough for a boy with no family name, no money, and no safety net. While many of his classmates had wealthy fathers to open doors, Herbert had only his determination. He knew that if he wanted to survive, he had to prove himself, not just in America, but in the wider world. So with little more than his education and an iron will, Hoover set out as a mining engineer. His first jobs were harsh and dangerous. In the gold fields of California and Nevada, he worked under the blazing sun, crawling into mines where the air was heavy with dust and the sound of picks echoed endlessly. While others complained, Hoover pressed on, always studying, always learning. It wasn't long before opportunity knocked in a way he could never have predicted. A British mining company needed an engineer willing to travel across the globe to Australia. Most young men hesitated at the thought of leaving everything familiar. But Herbert, the boy who had once lost everything, had nothing to fear. He boarded a ship and began the first of many journeys that would take him far beyond the United States. In Australia, Hoover worked tirelessly in remote, dangerous mines. He was young, but his sharp mind and problem-solving skills made him stand out. Soon, he was managing entire operations, commanding respect from men twice his age. From Australia, his work took him to China, where he not only braved mines but also lived through political unrest, even dodging bullets during the Boxer Rebellion. By his 30s, Herbert Hoover had transformed himself from an orphaned farm boy into one of the world's most respected engineers. He was known as the man who could turn failing mines into profitable enterprises, a problem solver who thrived where others gave up. His name carried weight in cities and capitals far from his small hometown in Iowa. But perhaps the most important change came within him. Traveling across continents, Hoover saw not just mines and wealth, but poor families, hungry children, desperate workers. Their struggles echoed his own childhood of loss and hunger. A thought began to take root in his heart. If he had found a way to rise above poverty, maybe he could one day help others do the same. This quiet realization would become the foundation of his future. For now, he was still an engineer, still climbing. But destiny was already setting the stage. The orphan who once begged for opportunity was being shaped into something greater and unexpected, leader in times when the world would need him most. By the year 1914, Herbert Hoover had built a global reputation as a brilliant engineer. He was wealthy, respected, and settled with his wife Lou Henry. Life could have gone on comfortably for him. But history had other plans. That summer, war erupted in Europe, the First World War. Armies clashed across nations, and suddenly, millions of ordinary people, families, children, workers were caught in the firestorm of hunger and destruction. At first, Hoover was far from the front lines. He was in London when war broke out, overseeing business matters. But then, a desperate crisis reached his doorstep. Thousands of Americans, stranded in Europe with no money and no way home, came begging for help. Governments were paralyzed, banks closed, and fear was everywhere. Hoover did not hesitate. He gathered volunteers, raised funds, and organized safe passage for over 120,000 Americans back home. Newspapers began calling him the Great Organizer, a man who could bring order to chaos. But his greatest test was still ahead. Belgium, a small, innocent nation, had been invaded by German forces. Its people faced starvation as food supplies were cut off. Millions of men, women, and children were at risk of dying. The world hesitated. The politics were messy. But Hoover couldn't look away. He remembered his own childhood hunger, the emptiness that gnawed at him after his parents died. He could not allow an entire nation to starve. So he took on the impossible. With no official power, Hoover organized the Commission for Relief in Belgium, a massive humanitarian effort. Ship by ship, he arranged for tons of food to be delivered, negotiating with governments and even enemy armies to let supplies through. It was dangerous. At any moment, his work could have failed. Yet, against all odds, the orphan boy from Iowa became the lifeline of an entire nation. Over the course of the war, his organization fed more than 10 million people every single day, one of the greatest humanitarian missions in history. By the time the war ended, Herbert Hoover was no longer just a mining engineer. He was known worldwide as the man who had given food to the starving, hope to the hopeless. For the first time, the world saw in him not just a successful man, but a leader shaped by compassion. The journey that had begun with hunger and loneliness in a small Iowa town was now touching millions across oceans. And though Hoover himself did not yet know it, this mission would one day carry him straight into the highest office of his country.
Thanks you for watch. Every old story holds a lesson worth remembering. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for watch and listen more old times, real stories, and don't forget,